Criminal justice reform is becoming a focus of the 2020 election. Many candidates are aiming their proposals at curbing what's become the highest incarceration rate in the world. Experts say one way they could do that is through clemency. That's a constitutional right granted to a president to either commute a sentence or pardon someone's conviction. However, while the clemency debate is starting to take shape in the 2020 Democratic race, advocates tell CBS News the conversation has not gone far enough. The reporter of that article joins me now. Tyler Kendall is a CBSN associate producer. So, Tyler, please put into context for us, why is clemency so important?
Right. So clemency is one of the few initiatives that a president can do all by themselves. They don't need to ask Congress to help approve it. So when we talk about criminal justice platforms of these candidates, it's really important to delineate between what a president can do themselves versus what they have to ask others to do. So we hear a lot about sentencing reforms, for example. And while every advocate will say it's really important that these candidates are elevating the conversation around reducing mandatory minimums, for example, at the end of the day, an initiative like that has to get through what's often a gridlocked Congress. Meanwhile, clemency doesn't have to go through that process. Plus, legislation oftentimes isn't retroactive, meaning that it will help people going forward, but it does nothing for those that are already incarcerated. So clemency oftentimes can act as kind of like a last resort for somebody if they're seeking to spend less time behind bars and they don't have that relief that some sentencing reforms provide.
So what have we seen the candidates discuss when it comes to clemency?
Right. So Senator Cory Booker got a lot of attention after the last debate in Houston, where he brought up this idea that on the first day of his administration, he would look at 17,000 cases and make them eligible for clemency. 17,000 is the number that his campaign says are the individuals that would have been sentenced differently under the First Step Act. So that goes back to what I was saying about how the majority of the First Step Act isn't retroactive. So a lot of people didn't see relief, whereas they would have if they were sentenced today. And this other initiative that we're hearing a lot of candidates talk about is this idea of an independent commission. So currently, the clemency process goes through the Department of Justice. A lot of advocates have a problem with that because the DOJ is the exact same department that prosecuted these people in the first place. Also, the DOJ is comprised of a lot of political appointments, so there could be some political bias in this process. So we've seen candidates such as Senator Amy Klobuchar. She's really championing this idea of creating a nonpartisan commission. She's a former prosecutor herself, so this would help streamline the process. So instead of taking years in some cases to go through the DOJ, instead it would go through an independent commission and then straight to the president with a recommendation.
Very interesting. So give us some sort of historical context. What has been the approach to clemency in the past?
Right. So, of course, it is easier said than done. We saw the Obama administration really try to bolster its clemency initiative. But at the end of the day, an internal review by the DOJ found that it was actually, quote, poorly implemented. It had a lot of snags along the road. And by the time Obama's term was over, we saw that he granted about 5% of clemency petitions, higher than his predecessor. George W. Bush had a 2% rate. Wow. And Bill Clinton had a 6% rate. But still, these numbers, 5, 2, 6%, they all stand in stark contrast to previous generations where we saw President Kennedy, for example, granting 36% of petitions.
And because the incarceration rate is so high, they just don't have the ability to review and grant clemency at the rate they used to.
Well, so that's part of it. Part of it is the sheer numbers of petitions that they get today due to mass incarceration in America. But also a lot of advocates point me to the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which actually eliminated parole at the federal level. So now all those people that would have seen less time behind bars because they could have gotten parole don't have that ability anymore. So instead, they have to seek clemency. Another reason is just clemency can be pretty controversial. I spoke to a lot of experts that said that presidents and governors alike, because this happens at the state level too, of course, there's this political calculus that they have to take into account because, you know, oftentimes there's going to be somebody that might be opposed to someone that's incarcerated, not serving the full amount of time behind bars that their sentence mandated. So that's actually why we see the majority of clemency petitions granted towards the end of a president or a governor's term. So most of the advocates that I spoke to say that, yes, we need to implement these structural changes that I mentioned before, but at the end of the day, we also have to address the political climate if we want to see any real tangible change for clemency reform.
Tyler Kendall, this was fascinating. Thank you so much for your research and your reporting and for joining us.